We have an important submission to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of the gun company Smith & Wesson, as well as Interstate Arms, in their case against the government of Mexico. That's right. You may recall from last week that a federal district court judge in Massachusetts dismissed virtually every defendant from this case brought by the plaintiff, the government of Mexico, against the major gun companies in the United States, all in an attempt, in my view, to destroy the industry and to destroy our Second Amendment. But the good news is most of the defendants have already been dismissed from this case due to a lack of personal jurisdiction, but there's still a couple companies left, and they're right now petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court for their case to be heard under a very important federal statute dealing with gun manufacturing immunity. We're going to talk about it when we get back. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and author of the brand new best-selling book, Israel Disarmed: What the 10/7 Terrorist Attacks Against Israel Teach We Americans About the Right to Keep and Bear Arms. Must always learn from the mistakes of others. A lot of you I know have picked up the book, and of course, if you're going to be down in Knoxville, Tennessee this weekend, feel free to stop on by. I'm going to be doing a book signing as well as speaking about the Second Amendment. If you're at the Gun Owners of America first ever national convention in Knoxville, Tennessee this weekend, feel free to stop by and say hi and talk about the Second Amendment. All right, folks, so this is a big deal. This is sort of inside baseball, a little geeky. You may have missed this. But as you recall last week, the government of Mexico had brought this huge lawsuit, I'm guessing in conjunction with the consultation, with the support of the Joe Biden-Kamala Harris administration, because I find it very hard to believe that the government of Mexico would come into the United States and sue the most important, well, many of the most important gun companies in this country. And we're smart enough to somehow pick the absolute worst court system in America to bring their lawsuit, worst in the sense of refusing to protect the right to keep and bear arms, and that is the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit in Boston, Massachusetts, which is where the government of Mexico chose, of all 50 states, they chose to sue the gun companies in Boston, Massachusetts, well within the jurisdiction of the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, an absolute terrible anti-gun court. There's no combination of two or more judges that you can possibly get on a three-judge panel that will be any good on gun-related issues. And as you may recall, the first argument made by the gun companies was the correct one, that under a federal statute known as the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PILCA, that basically says that you cannot hold gun companies civilly liable in court for the criminal conduct of third parties over whom the gun companies have no control, which makes a lot of sense. In fact, it makes so much sense, this has been the law in the Anglosphere for literally hundreds and hundreds of years, going all the way back to jolly old England. But of course, what happened is in the late 1990s, in certain terrible anti-gun jurisdictions, anti-gun mayors sued the gun companies, all in an attempt to impose litigation costs on them, not really expecting to win the case on the merits, but to simply make it expensive to do business and make it costly to go through these multi-year lawsuits, because lawyers are expensive. They're very expensive. Trust me, I know. And of course, in 2005, to deal with these abusive litigation tactics, lawfare, if you will, the federal government passed the PILCA law, the Protection in Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, in 2005 that George W. Bush as president signed into law, with the support, by the way, of the Pentagon and law enforcement, because if you destroy the American gun industry, not only does it prevent you and I from being able to buy guns from gun companies, because they won't be there to sell it to us, it actually also hurts our national defense, because you need gun companies to sell guns to the military and to law enforcement. And the last thing any of us wants is to be dependent upon Russia or China or some foreign power for us to be able to acquire guns, either for private purposes under the Second Amendment or for public purposes, either our military or our law enforcement agencies. So that's why they enacted in 2005 a clear federal statute that immunized the gun companies, for all intents and purposes, from criminal conduct. And of course, what happened is the government of Mexico is basically bringing one of these frivolous lawsuits, as I see it, in Boston, Massachusetts, saying that the way the gun companies in the United States market, sell, and distribute their guns, it somehow, allegedly, with the gun company's knowledge, allows these guns to walk across the border into Mexico, where Mexico suffers from quote-unquote gun violence, all because of the contributions and the aiding and abetting efforts of America's gun companies. Well, obviously, this law, PILCA, should have stopped these cases in their tracks, because the entire purpose of this law is to stop these kinds of lawsuits. But because Mexico sued in the United States Court of Appeals for the First Circuit, as I predicted, crappy court, crappy judges on this issue, you're going to get crappy results. And that's exactly what happened here. The U.S. Court of Appeals says, the government of Mexico has made just enough allegations to allow this case to go into discovery. And then after that, on the good news front, sort of silver lining front, that case was sent back to the U.S. Court of Appeal, U.S. District Court, and the District Court at least dismissed all the out-of-state gun companies on the grounds that they had no connection to speak of with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They had no offices there. Their headquarters were not there. They were not incorporated in Massachusetts. So all those out-of-state gun companies were dismissed from the case. Unfortunately for Smith & Wesson and a company called Interstate Arms, they're based in part in Massachusetts. So they were not able to move to get out of the case on the grounds that there was no jurisdiction over them in Massachusetts because they were in Massachusetts. And if you're in Massachusetts, the courts have jurisdiction over you, so they couldn't get off from a lack of jurisdiction. So now what they've done is they've just written a letter to the U.S. Supreme Court, because there's a petition for cert before the Supreme Court asking the court to hear the case, meaning the Supreme Court to hear this case, and to impose and to require the lower courts to interpret and apply and protect the gun industry using the PILCA federal statute. In a very powerful brief that's been submitted on behalf of Smith & Wesson Interstate Arms, saying this is absurd. And now there's a letter that was just filed a day or so ago, saying that notwithstanding the fact that the other co-defendants have been dismissed, in some ways they say it makes it worse for Smith & Wesson, because now they're one of only two defendants left. And because the government of Mexico is suing them for joint and several liability for all the costs associated with gun violence in Mexico, as absurd as the theory is, they want to give all those bills for all the costs associated with gun violence to Smith & Wesson Interstate Arms. It's simply insane. Nevertheless, that's where we are right now. So they wrote a letter to the U.S. Supreme Court and says, you need to grant cert because this case is still very important and it's still pending as to Smith & Wesson Interstate Arms. Then they go on to mention that the other companies that were dismissed from this lawsuit may be brought back in because the government of Mexico is going to seek an appeal from the U.S. Court of Appeals from the First Circuit, which is a terrible anti-gun jurisdiction, and maybe they're going to find a way to hook these defendants into Massachusetts. And as a reminder, the other gun companies that were sued were Barrett Firearms, Glock, Sturm Ruger, Century Arms, and Beretta. Mexico wants to bring them all back in, those companies all back in, to be sued along with Smith & Wesson. So Smith & Wesson wrote this powerful letter to the U.S. Supreme Court saying you really need to resolve this. And some of the quotes that they provided to the U.S. Supreme Court in their petition for cert is quite powerful. Let me give you just a couple of examples of their arguments as to why the Supreme Court... The stakes of this case underscore why review is needed. Absent this court's intervention, Mexico's multi-billion-dollar suit will hang over the American firearms industry for years, inflicting costly and intrusive discovery at the hands of a foreign sovereign that is trying to bully the industry into adopting a host of gun control measures that have been repeatedly rejected by American voters. Worse, so long as the decision below remains good law, scores of similar lawsuits are destined to follow from other governments, both foreign and domestic, all seeking to distract from their own political failings by laying the blame for criminal violence at the feet of the American firearms industry. Even if ultimately unsuccessful, the cost of that litigation will be devastating, not only for the defendants, but more importantly, and listen carefully, folks, but more importantly, for the millions of law-abiding Americans who rely on the firearms industry to effectively exercise their Second Amendment rights. This type of lawfare is exactly what Congress enacted PILCA to avoid. Very powerful language there from the gun industry to the U.S. Supreme Court in this Government of Mexico lawsuit. Now, I should also make one additional observation why I think there's a very good chance that the Supreme Court may hear this case. One of the lawyers, the lead lawyer, is No Francisco. Now, No Francisco is the lead lawyer for the gun industry in this case and is representing Smith & Wesson here. Now, why is that particularly important? It's very important because No Francisco was the Solicitor General of the United States under Donald Trump. So No Francisco is considered one of the best lawyers in America. Everyone at the Supreme Court knows who he is, has heard arguments from him, and respects him greatly. So the fact that he is involved in this case, asking the Supreme Court to hear this case, is extremely important and extremely valuable and dramatically increases the odds, in my view, of the U.S. Supreme Court taking this case and hearing it and once and for all stopping this lawfare, because Congress adopted the PILCA statute specifically to deal with these kinds of issues, i.e. suing lawful, law-abiding American gun companies over the costs and problems associated with the behavior of third-party thugs, terrorists, criminals, whom the gun companies have literally never met, never mind exercised no control over. How on earth can you and I be held liable, for example, of the criminal activities of people we don't even know? This is like holding a baseball bat company liable for someone that takes a baseball bat and commits a crime with it. How can you hold a baseball bat company liable for that? Or, back in the day, a VCR CD manufacturer, or Betamax going all the way back. That's actually kind of important because there's a Supreme Court case on this point involving a Betamax. Just because someone can misuse and violate copyright laws or engage in illegal videotaping or illegal activity with, let's say, the internet, a computer, okay, a CD player, a VCR, a Betamax, whatever you want to call it, okay, that does not allow you to ban that or destroy that industry just because someone can misbehave with the item. Because you can misbehave and commit a crime with anything. But that's not how we measure freedom or how we measure whether or not a product is good and useful for America. Okay, folks, well, we'll keep you abreast as to what happens in this major case involving the government of Mexico's lawsuit against the gun industry there in Massachusetts and before the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll be hearing something about this in the next several months, and we will let you know what happens with the Supreme Court when it happens. And don't forget to follow me on X at @ForBoxDiner. Don't forget to subscribe. We're trying to grow this channel to get to 200,000 subscribers. We're working hard to do that. And again, if you're in Knoxville, Tennessee at the Gun Owners of America National Convention, feel free to stay high, and we will see you again soon. Very soon, I hope, here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.